ọ̀rọ̀ lẹ́yẹ ń gbọ́ ẹyẹ òdélé bá lórùlé o ọ̀rọ̀ ni.
32 teeth following, so they are swallowing. Monkey is swallowing. Snake self swallowing. Next, a swallow two will fly and come and swallow. You're ever swallow in a hollow gallow, making a whole lot of halabaloo. Jalikalu, we know say you chop the money some, so give me the loot. Do you really want a revolution or just your turn? Cause if you really want a revolution, all this for ban.
Welcome to the Ake Book and Arts Festival 2020 online. I'm Abdulkareem Baba Aminu, and I'll be moderating a panel with Nnedi Okorafor, Marlon James, and Roye Okupe. Hi, Nnedi.
Hello.
Hello, Marlon.
Hey, how's it going?
What's up, Roye?
Hey, how you doing?
Cool. Now, first of all, I'll set the tone. I'm a huge fan of all three of you. Huge fan. So I'm just going to get that right out of the way, without screaming. It's a really big honor for me to moderate this panel. And a lot of the questions are personal questions. I've realized things I've always wanted to know, and then now I have the opportunity to ask them, all you three great people. So I'm going to start by asking, what would you say is your origin story, the moment you decided to tell a story weaving African history and elements of futurism, and even fantasy? I would like Nnedi to go first, please.
Yeah, for me, it was always organic. From the very first story that I wrote, I was doing that. It was always something that I just did. So it's like, I couldn't even call it an origin story because it's part of what I do. Like, it's by definition what I do. The very first official short, because like my road to becoming a writer and to just even deciding to be the one to make up the stories that's a whole different thing. That's like a very long story. But the first short story that I wrote was for a creative writing class. It wasn't something that I really thought about it was like for the class, it was a short story class, and they're like, okay, just write a story. And the first thing that I thought to write, without even considering what I was doing, it was a story that was based on, it was sort of memoirish. It was something that had happened to myself with my two sisters when we were little, and it was in Nigeria. It was about this really strange incident that happened in Imo State. When I sat down to write this story, the strangeness of the story itself mixed with my own imagination, it just naturally lent itself to weaving in kind of just I guess what you would consider African mythology or Nigerian mythology, folklore, whatever. It was just a natural thing. It wasn't something that I thought about. It was just when I was asked to write a story, that's what happened. It wasn't something that I considered. It just was what it was.
How about you, Roye?
For me personally, it's hard to pinpoint one exact moment. I grew up watching all sorts of superhero and fantasy stories, from Batman, Superman, the Avengers, Ninja Turtles, Transformers. And for me, that was my first love. But for me, there was always something that I felt like was a huge missed opportunity. And that was not telling these stories from an African perspective. I always wondered, like, wouldn't it be so cool to see how this genre would look if we, as Africans started to create stories, our own superhero stories, our own fantasy stories, our own sci-fi stories. But for me personally, I actually got into writing accidentally because when I first started, on the journey to, okay, I wanted to create my own stories, I actually didn't want to write. I just wanted to give a writer my ideas. So the funny story is that initially when I first, in 2013, when I started to, conceptualize some of my ideas, I sent out offers to a whole bunch of writers saying, hey, here's my idea, I'll pay you to help me write this. And literally everybody rejected me. So I was like, well, cool. I'm just going to have to figure out how to write myself then. Honestly, since then, by taking classes, reading different books and finding different mentors, I was able to start to create my own stories. So I would say it's never been really one moment because I've always had in my head like these concepts of African superheroes, African fantasy stories, African sci-fi stories, you know, told from an African perspective by Africans for the world. And I just sort of stumbled into it, you know, when I figured that, well, if no one's going to help me do it, then I'm just going to have to do it myself.
How about you, man?
Well, you know, like, you know, I come from comics as well, comics and graphic novels. And a lot of the really big books of fantasy I actually didn't read till I was older. I think it was last year. I gave the J.R.R. Tolkien lecture at Oxford, and I was talking about what it must mean, what it feels like when you can take your mythology for granted. The example I gave was King Arthur. So the average British person doesn't think about King Arthur much, but King Arthur is crucial to the British identity, because King Arthur and Camelot reinforces the idea that British people, and by extension white people, were always civilized. And Britain was one of the most backward places in the country. It was appalling how backward and disgusting they were. And but the myth creates that whole thing of civilization, which is essential to them. And then I started to think, well, what happens when you grow up and you don't have that? You know, and I grew up in the diaspora, so even now, when we teach history in the Caribbean, chapter 1 is slavery. It's like, you know, it's still, so there is still this sort of amputation from the head. Well, that's redundant. Amputation is cut in the head. There's still this amputation that happens when we talk about that. So history. So my origin wasn't even looking for stories to write. It was looking for stories to read and to believe and so on. I remember last time I was at Aki Festival, and one of the panelists said to me, "You ever think that maybe the reason Black kids don't do so well in school is that they were never meant to be taught that way?" And I never forgot. And I was from the first Aki Festival. The convoluted point I was making is I had to go searching for that kind of origin, and for in order to use a lot of the legends and mythologies and religions and so on as this reservoir to dip into. Because before that, you know, it was me writing in a way that, even though I'm writing Western stories and writing literary fiction, it was always a struggle. My first book was rejected 78 times. My second book, only one publisher wanted it. And I always thought, you know, I didn't want to become a European writer. I didn't want to become an American writer with just darker skin. I knew there was something else. And honestly, it wasn't until searching for those things that I found it.
Cool. So then the next question is African futurism, one word. Afrofuturism, speculative fiction. You know, they're all pretty hot right now, and they show no signs of stopping. What would you say is the reason for these stories being so compelling? You know, of course, other than the fact that they're bloody good stories. You know, what would you say? I would ask Nnedi again.
It's a complicated question that I don't think about very often, because these stories are always compelling to me. They've always been of interest to me. They've always been things that I want to see. You know, they've always been there, and audiences have become interested in them now for various reasons. I mean, we can cite Black Panther as being the thing but I don't agree with that. I think there were things. I think there were things happening before Black Panther happened. I mean, there's a whole genre of science fiction and fantasy written by Black writers that has been, you know, that has been there for decades.
Okay. Yeah. So, Marlon, how about you?
I agree. I think these stories are always there. And, you know, Samuel Delaney has been doing this since the 50s. Ishmael Reed has been blurring fantasy and satire and history for a while. You know, Octavia Butler. You know, it's so these stories have always been there. And then even if you go further back to, like, you know, the Forest of a Thousand Demons. I remember what I think Wole Soyinka translated it and gave it a different title. These stories, you know, the stories that have always been there. I do think, though, if I wonder, because so many of my friends were also blurring reality and so on, and we were wondering about it. And I do think some of it is a response to the times we're in. You know, extreme times have always so far for a while in history, extreme times have always resulted in people turning back to myths and turning back to mythologies. To use Lord of the Rings again as an example, you know, those books came out because people are trying to make sense of World War and trying to make sense of massive evil and great atrocity. And I think that especially in this time where things are so unmoored, where things are so coming to a head about, you know, racism and Black Lives Matter, and Black Lives Matter is something that has sparked different kinds of responses all over the world. It's really interesting to see what happened in the Caribbean, for example. But I think that more and more people are paying attention because it's harder to deny it now. It's harder to suppress these stories. It's harder to say there isn't a market for it when it's hard to say there isn't a market for a Black story when Lovecraft Country is doing so well. You know, so I think that there is a bigger sense of awareness of these stories, but it's not a sense of discovering new things. It's sort of jumping on something that was always there. Because one thing we all realize is know that everybody is into Afrofuturism. You know, the stories were there waiting on them all this time, and there are new stories being written. So it's not. It's. I think both of those are happening. I'm glad people are discovering these things, but I think it is important to recognize that we've been telling these stories forever.
Thanks, Marlon. How about you, Roye? What's your experience?
I mean, I think like, you know, Nnedi and Marlon has said, these things, it's very important to understand that they've always existed and for a very long time. But trying to pinpoint one particular reason why you know, these stories, whatever you want to call it, you know, African futurism, Afrofuturism, you know, Black speculative fiction, it's not just one reason. I think it's a bunch of different things. I think, like Marlon said, the times are changing. I also think, unfortunately, the mainstream places like Hollywood, they're incentivized by money, and for a very long time, the narrative was that you can't make money with, you know, majority Black cast or, you know, having Black leads. You can't make money overseas with that, and all these different, I mean, just these different statements that people made. And I think Black Panther really, you know, dispelled a lot of that. Unfortunately, it took that long, you know, for something like that to happen. I think that also adds to it as well. I also think that a lot of credit has to go to, you know, even people like, you know, Nnedi, who have been doing this for a very long time at a very high level, and people like her breaking through the proverbial glass ceiling and allowing people like me to come after her and stand on her shoulders to be able to create my own work as well. And then just the, you know, the self-publishers and the independent creators, you see a lot of that in the comic book space where people are no longer waiting for permission from bigger publishers to tell their own stories, and a lot of and I think also a lot has to do with even just consumer fatigue of the same things over and over and over and over again. People want to see stuff that is different. People want to see they want to experience different cultures. It's why human beings love to travel so much. You know, you want to see something that's different from your environment, and I think books, you know, film, TV, animation, cartoons, that is one way for you to experience different cultures and also experience entertainment, you know, at the same time. So, you know, a lot of people they want to see something different. And at the end of the day, it's not necessarily about, you know, Black fiction or whatever. Like, these stories are, you know, first and foremost, they're great stories. They're great characters who just happen to be Black or African. And it's not that we shouldn't highlight the fact that, okay, this is based on African history, culture, and mythology, but these are just great stories, period, first. And that's what people want at the end of the day.
A good deal of sci-fi and indeed speculative fiction and fantasy include political undertones, allegories, and sometimes even messages. Does your work contain some of these? And is it a conscious effort when it does? Marlon, could you please take this first?
Yeah, I think speculative fiction has always been political. I think it's like when people say I don't care about politics. I'm like, yeah, it's a political statement. You know, an example of say Tarzan, you know, is political in the sense of it was really adamant on pushing a sort of white supremacy kind of idea that here comes the European colonizer, we will colonize everything, including the apes. And it's still, it endures. Even the adventure story, you know, I tend to call the adventure story the will the white man come back alive story, which is still, it's a political statement. As for a story that situates itself in an African or a Black diasporic sort of idiom without necessarily ever acknowledging Europe or Europeans, it's not meant to be political, but it ends up being that way anyway. And as for me, it's in both ways. There are some that I didn't even realize was being political. There's some because I was just telling a story, and I tell stories first. I was setting out to you know, to undermine some things that even I, as somebody in the diaspora, take for granted. A good example is all the connotations that appear in, if you're raised, you know, a very Western, not Western type of socialization, all the connotations that just popped up in your head when I say midnight.
Yeah.
And almost everyone is shaped by a Eurocentric idea of midnight, about darkness, about evil, about the witching hour, about all of that. And it was funny researching a lot of vampires or vampiric characters in African mythology and realized that they all attacked in broad daylight. Evil time of day was high noon. That noon, you know, midnight was for the ancestors. Just something like that, if you're in the diaspora, is such a radical rethinking of things you have taken for granted. If it affects your life, it's political. And I think, yeah. So whether even saying we stay away from politics is a political statement.
Okay, thanks, Marlon. How about you, Nnedi? What does that hold for you?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts here. I think that when it comes to the political, you know, and I agree with everything that Marlon just said. But I want to add to it this idea of the political often being that Black narratives are viewed through a white gaze, and the political aspects are added. Every Black narrative is political. I'm just thinking about my my new novel, Ikenga, which is set in Nigeria, and it in no way, like at no point is it does it mention the United States or have anything to do with that part of the world. And in like 4 of my interviews, I've been asked, has it been inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement? Mm-hmm. You know, wow. Is this a story about they asked me questions about, like, the main character is a Black boy, and he's a Nigerian boy, and they asked me, how is he struggling with his Blackness? And I'm like, how? Like 1,000 things go through my mind, and I'm like, how do I explain this in a way where they understand that the very question is problematic? You know, so like this idea of what is political, and then there are things that I write about that are political, but they're taking things from a point of view that's outside of the white gaze. So the political aspect, like, is that whole decentralized, like, one of my things that I'm always very concerned and interested in doing is decentralizing the default. Because of that assumption, when someone looks at my story, they think, okay, this is the political framework that it is struggling with. When it's not, it's completely outside of that. It's a different political framework. So, like, I'm fascinated and at times angered and disgusted by this issue, and like this idea that, like, every time I want to talk about a Black narrative, it has to be held up against a white narrative of some sort. Like, I'm like, can we decentralize that? You know, can we have a conversation where we can understand that, like, the world is a big place and the points of views are different and diverse, and then look at it from that point of view and see how the story shifts and how the understanding of the story shifts. That's really where it comes from. Like, and of course, yeah, everything's political. Yeah, I believe that everything's the personal is political. There's no way, and there's nothing wrong with that. I don't think like I've heard the sentiment of, you know, why does it always have to be political? And like, do you live life? Are you alive? How can you not, like, what is it? You're always involved in some kind of conversation. You're just by being, but that. And then there's one other point that I wanted to make really quickly. If I can remember it, it was from the other comment. It was about the significance of I'm just going to say Black stories, because I just like Black stories, the diaspora on the continent, whatever, and how that's become something now that's so interesting, especially Hollywood right now. I just want to ask that question of, okay, so it wasn't significant to you until you realized it could make money. You know, like that sentiment is very problematic to me and somewhat racist. Like, it's irrelevant until you can use it. You know, like, I know we all want to push these stories through, and we want to have all these wonderful TV series and whatever made, but like, I think we need to stop and consider that sentiment and how problematic that is, because that's going to come up again in the future. But I'll stop talking now.
Thank you very much, Nnedi. How about you, Roye? What's your take on this?
I mean, the whole thing about, and I think Marlon and Nnedi said it very well, like inherently almost everything, if not everything, is political when you're talking about a story. The question is it overt or is it covert in terms of how it comes up in the story? But it's funny how, I'm more connected to, the superhero genre, but it's funny how you can, a movie like Captain America Civil War can come out, which is extremely political. And people herald it as one of the best movies Marvel has made. And you do, whatever you want to call it, Black fiction, Black fantasy or whatever, and people's like, oh, it's too political. So there is inherently a double standard there. Whereas something can be heralded as, oh, wow, this is brilliant storytelling when it's Captain America, but, do the same thing, with a Black lead character or a group of Black, people doing something. And it's like, oh, this is too much. So this is the type of stuff Nnedi's talking about, that it's like, it's not even just the subject matter itself. It's just the way people think about, Black fiction, again, whatever you want to call it. Like, there's a problem as to just the perception. And until we start to unpack these things, and you're seeing that happen just in the world in general with the Black Lives Matter movement and everything that is going on, and the fight against police brutality and inequality and racial injustice, until we start to unpack things, we're not going to really get anywhere, because it's just going to be the same thing over and over again. We're going to go through these phases of, oh, okay, yeah, everybody's going to have, all networks are going to have these different Black shows. We're all going to be happy. But if we don't tackle the inherent bias and all these underlying issues, we're never going to get to the point that we want to be.
Thank you very much, Roye. Now the next question is, I'm just going to ask how, all of you here, all three of you have, tons of well-received work in a variety of genres and even subgenres. Some of you have even done nonfiction, really kick-ass nonfiction, I might add. But what would you say is different when you're creating, within an African fantastical and futuristic context? I would like Nnedi to go first, please.
African fantastical versus what, like other things, or?
Oh yeah. Well, okay, directly to Nnedi now, like the Outer Spaces book. No, she actually has the Outer Spaces book.
I know.
Yeah. Which by the way is right here, right there. Yeah. I love it. It's brilliant. Yeah, really heartfelt. Now, what the question is, how do you get out of your head space? Yeah, this is basically a technique thing now to write this. That's Outer Spaces. Yeah, as opposed to when you're writing, let's say sci-fi or African futurism or like Ikenga, for instance. that, because like all three of you, I've read everything you've put out, believe me, yeah. And I see there's this deft movement from one thing to the other. You know, you don't play, yeah. And it's that movement from one thing to another so comfortably, so deftly. I'm trying to understand. This is me as a fan now asking, you know. So that's basically what this question was trying to ask.
Yeah. Okay, so Broken Places in Outer Spaces is my memoir. It's short. I will say it's short. I always talk about length, but it's short. It's about a specific time in my life. It's about the time. It's about how I became a writer, there's a lot to that. When I wrote it, though, it's like there's really no line. There's no line between, you know, writing nonfiction and speculative fiction. There's no line. I mean, I wrote a journalistic piece that dealt with solar power in Morocco,
yeah.
And then that kind of went into science fiction. Like it went from factual and scientific stuff to science fiction in the same article. Like, and that was the most natural thing for me to write. Writing Broken Places in Outer Spaces, if you read it, it's written. There are elements in there that would bleed right into what I write. Like the first of all, when I first started writing, I came to writing the science fictional stuff a little bit later, but the first thing that I wrote, which was the memoir piece, like the nonfiction piece of when I was little with my sisters, that seemed to have these fantastical elements. It's part of how I view the world. Like I view the world as a magical place. Like that is just my natural point of view. I see things that other people would say are not there, but they are there to me. So like when I'm just describing something, if I'm going to write memoir, it's going to have this feel to it. Like even with Broken Places in Outer Spaces, there are definitely elements in there that someone could read as speculative. When I wrote that first short story, I wasn't thinking that I was writing speculative fiction. I wasn't thinking that, okay, this is a fantasy narrative, this is a fantasy story that I wasn't thinking anything. I was writing what I remembered from back then. And those elements, just the way that I see the world, the way that I describe the world, naturally had, like when other students read that short story, that first one, it was called The House of Deformities. When they read it, they thought it was fantasy. And I was writing, it was like I was writing nonfiction. So like, I think, that's part of what lends itself to me being able to kind of move through all of these different types of writing, because to me, everything is sci-fi. Everything is, has that fantastical, mystical element. The world is very mystical. Like I look at what's happening now here in the United States, I see mystical elements, some of them evil, but yeah, it's the way that it's very much the way that I view the world that makes it easy to kind of move from one thing to another. And there's no, I wouldn't say there is really an effort in it. It's very organic. Everything grows and is kind of connected to everything else.
Okay, thank you very much, Nnedi. So Roye, you're next. In the same question, and just for a little, context, you have Malaika, the warrior queen, and she's set firmly in the past. And then you also have EXO, which is the future, technologically advanced setting and all that. And there's even a storyline now, the one where all your characters, because they occupy the same world, basically are connected, which I think is brilliant, by the way. I love it.
Thank you.
So yeah, so the process, of I don't want to say the cross-pollination. No, that's
I get what you're saying. I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
And for me, it's very easy. It's not simple, like writing these stories. It's not, but it's easy. And I'll say easy because I'm simply just putting out stories that I would love to read. I find out that when I try to do something that's either trendy or what I think, this publisher would like, or what I think this group of people would like. That's when I get into trouble, because now I'm trying to force myself into a box that I was not meant to be in. So I am just, whether I'm doing stuff that's, you know, like Malika that's pre-colonial, or EXO that's near future, or Iyanu that's like prehistoric. To me, it's just stuff I want to see. And you know, ever since I started reading Marvel comics, or you know, and you know, DC comics, and watching the animation and things like the Justice League and the Avengers, I've always wanted to see how that would work from an African perspective. And that's what I'm doing right now. I'm just doing what I want to see, and it comes natural to me because these are books that I would buy if I went to the comic book store, or went to the library, or the bookstore, or if I turned on my TV, or stuff I want to see on Netflix right now. So to me, it's just natural, because that's what I want. And you know, and if people also happen to want that, a bunch of people, then you know, that lucky me. It always starts with what do I want to see, and the moment I start going away from that, that's the moment I start hating what I'm doing, and that's not a place I want to be in.
Thank you very much, Roye. How about you, Marlon? I mean, you know, Marlon. You know, when you just did the Red Wolf book, oh my, it was such a huge shock for me, you know, a pleasant shock. Yeah, and I loved it. I can't wait for the next one. So how did you, you know, make that switch?
Yeah,
it was deaf.
Yeah. Well, to me, I think I made it because I didn't think it was a switch. You know, there are all these sort of different elements in all the stuff I write. You know, even the novel before it, you know, the chorus, the Greek chorus, is a ghost. Yeah. And it never it doesn't feel that way to me, because I also I don't read that way. You know, I don't have genre snobbery, mostly because I couldn't afford it. It's like, yeah, it's you know, the only category I needed for a new book was that it was next. And so I'd read anything. People think I'm joking when I said Jackie Collins is one of my favorite writers. I'm like, are you kidding? Hollywood Wives is the first novel I read in one sitting. I read that novel when I was 13, and when I finished it, I was like, I'm an adult now. And I've always the only category I needed for a book is that I could get it, and a lot of those I stole. So it's and I think that sort of omnivorous attitude to reading carried over into writing. You know, a huge influence on Black Leopard Red Wolf, probably the biggest influence on it, is Marvel Comics. To the point where I go, ooh, this character is too much like Storm, let's pull back. You know, or even the way I write fight scenes are very much Marvel Comics fight scenes. Because it's just it's those things. I never let those things go, and it's interesting how all the things I keep consuming show its way. Like for a book that references so much about the Sahel region in Africa, there are a lot of PJ Harvey lyrics in that book. Yeah, I remember a character just saying, "It's hard walking in a dress. It's not easy." I'm like, "Oh crap, that's PJ Harvey." And so it's and I've always been that way, and I've always written that way with all books. I remember somebody was telling me this story about what happened in Jamaica, and I told him, if you don't use that story within 2 years, I'm taking it from you. And he didn't use it, so I took it. I told him I was. It's like, you know, I tell my students, you know, you don't create stories, you find them. And when you find them is what you do with them. And for me, that's it. You just never know where you're gonna learn something from. It's you know, that block you're trying to fix in your space opera. Maybe it's some Tolstoy you need to read. I've always had this huge fear of missing out if I don't read a certain genre or so on. So I read everything, and I think because of that sensibility, it's easy for me. It doesn't feel like a switch to me when I'm switching.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Marlon. Talking about these things now, you know, I'm switching. I'm going a bit more to
switching?
you know, craft.
And switching.
That word again. So as writers, you know, the kind of writers you are, you three, I'm sure you have tons of stories still marinating at idea stage, you know, when do you know which one to, you know, pick, you know, and write to the end? When do you decide, like, now is this time for that story, you know? This is me now still trying to understand, you know, craft of it. I'll start with Nnedi again.
Yeah, I'm one of those who, like, if I have an idea for something or a character comes to me, if I hear the character speaking to me, and I feel like this, it's a very powerful, just a very powerful emotion of, oh, I love this. If I feel that, I will start it that evening. Like, I will start writing it like immediately, you know? So I don't have, there are little things that I hear, and I really like that idea, Marlon, of if you don't create something, you find them. You know, like there are things just stories all over the place, and they just come in weird forms at random times. So, you know, I've had those where like I'll hear something or find something or this bit of story, and I'll be like, okay, I'm gonna shelve that away. I'll just take that thing and I have like a whole file on my computer, a whole little box where I just throw things in there. So I have those. But like, if there's it's usually a character though. It's usually a character for me. If I hear that character start talking to me, and my characters are very, can be very ambitious and aggressive and relentless. But if they start talking to me, like, I will sit down and just start writing that immediately. There's no time in between of contemplating. And I'll just keep going. I recently finished a novel where that happened. Like, the character, I stepped out. It was actually when I arrived at an Ake festival, maybe in 2017 or something like that. I stepped out of the airport, the Lagos airport, and boom, the book hit me. Like, immediately. The story, this character started talking to me. I had never heard her voice or knew who she was at all. But like, I immediately was waiting for my ride. Once that we connected with everybody, sat down, and I wrote the first 2 paragraphs of that novel. And then I wrote more of it in my hotel room. It's like that, you know, like I don't wait. It's immediate. So I know, like, I'll know when it's something that's it's that thing. I don't have a term for what it is, but when that thing arrives, that's the thing. Yeah.
Thank you, Nnedi. How about you, Marlon? How does that, you know, strike you?
I'm so glad he didn't ask me first, because I'm still looking for tips on how to recognize stories. It's hard. It's my least favorite part of writing. It's nerve-wracking. It gives me a lot of stress. I break out in pimples. I just like, it's so, because I without fail, more often than not, I go through anywhere between 50 to 100. My record is 500 pages to figure out what to write. And those 500 pages did not happen. I went reach page 5, I think 550, and I go, this ain't it. So even every novel I have, including Black Leopard, Red Wolf, I can show you the number of pages it took to get to that. And for Black Leopard, it was around a good 45 pages. And I remember reaching page 45 and being really happy because I knew this is not the novel. So it's a lot of bumbling for me. It's a lot of bumbling around. It's a lot of trial and error. I wish I had an instinct sometimes. My problem is all the people that come up in my head, I think, is a story. And I think if everyone is a novel. And they fit in some way. And sometimes I will, because some of my best ideas come from just sort of taking myself out of the equation and just follow them. It's the same thing. I hear the voices as well and see the characters. And characters, that's the thing. When, you know, I envy people whose story comes up first and situation come up first. I'm like, damn. I just have people show up in my head and I don't know why they won't leave. And they refuse to leave until they figure out their story. And the worst part is they'll go, that's not it. And I'll write it another way. That's still ain't it. I was like, I mean, I was something like, you want to write it yourself then? And it's such a, it's I laugh about it now, but it's really hard figuring out. You have this character, you have this voice. What is your story, and how is the best way to tell it? And for me, it's always been trial and error. It's always been trying a bunch of things that fail until something happens. Usually for me, I used to say if I reach 50 pages, then I know. But I've gone 100 pages and don't know. So it's taking a risk. It's trial by error. It's sticking with a character and seeing if you're with them for the long haul, or if that's 10 pages is all they're telling you. And maybe that's a short story. But it's yeah, that's it for me. It's always been sort of fumbling my way into a novel. I think that's one of the reasons why they're so long, because once I find out, I'm like, you're going nowhere. We're stuck for the next 2 years. And I find it so hard to let them go.
Thank you very much, Marlon. How about you, Roye?
I think mine is a little bit of a combination between what Marlon and Nnedi said, because honestly, for me, I get most, I would say most of my best ideas come to me in the shower, and I'm sorry to put out that visual. I really apologize, guys.
Yeah,
but and then you have to decide, you know, do I not take a shower today, or do I go and write it down? Like, so I always have that conundrum at least once a week. But yeah,
who you're living with, how that usually ends up.
What's that?
I think to be asked who you're living with, how that usually ends up.
It usually ends up with me finishing. Yeah, for me, so I get these ideas and I just write them down. I write them down, and something else comes to me, and I keep on putting, you know, stuff into like very loose and rough outlines. But you know, it's funny what Marlon said, because for me, I still, like even till now, after writing 10 graphic novels, I still battle with the anxiety and at sometimes even the imposter syndrome of, am I actually even a good writer? So that actually, it weighs on me, and I keep on procrastinating actually starting the writing, because like I can just throw ideas. But one of the good things is that, again, like for me, I deal mostly with comics and now animation, is that you can sort of cheat a little bit with that, whereas you can just work with an artist and create like concept art of either the world or the character. Now you have something visually to actually look at. You have somebody that you can actually look at and see, okay, what's going to happen with these characters. And the last thing I would say is that for me, it always starts with a question, especially because my focus is African history, culture, and mythology. For instance, Malika, after I did research on Queen Amina of Zazzau, I really wanted to see, okay, what would happen if you did something with a character like this, where you put it in a setting where there's like magical swords and dragons in there? Like, how would that work? And then sort of like mesh those things together. With Iyanu, it started with the walls of Benin. Like, how did this look back then? Like, what would this look like if we put this real structure, this real amazing wonder of the earth, and surrounded with more fantastical elements as well too? With EXO, it was, how would Lagos look if a bunch of robots just dropped on 3rd Mainland Bridge, and everybody's like, what the heck is going on? So with me, it starts with those questions, and then I start to build out the story. But I think like one thing like comics and animation really helps me is because it's a very visual medium as well. So you can sort of cheat your way around that, as opposed to if I was, you know, writing prose or memoirs or things, I think I would even struggle more then. So yeah, comics was really for me a backdoor to get into writing, because I'm a very visual person, and it starts with me visually first, and then the writing starts to come together as well.
Thank you very much, Roye. Now I'm going to take a question from, you know, the IKEA website, where Nicole Walker from the USA asked that, you know, the question is, what are steps in your research process to develop and feature African languages, folklore, geography, character, worldviews, etc.? That's from Nicole Walker from the USA. Doesn't say where exactly, via the IKEA website. Would Marlon go first, please?
I mean, I do a ton of research for every book I write. In fact, I almost wrote a nonfiction how-to book on research. Somebody asked me to do it, but and maybe I will one day. It's because I do a lot of. I mean, I research the folklore, I research the legends, I research all the oral narratives for any oral narrative I can get my hand on, but also, especially when you're playing with this type of story, you also have to research carefully. I read a lot of if it's a history book about Africa written more than say 70 years ago, I pretty much read it for comic relief. It's they're thoroughly useless, absolutely useless books, but they're funny. And the cool thing, the thing is, if you're especially if you're researching anything on African content, you have to get to know contemporary history, and you have to know who's doing actual research right now, because it's really hard. It's so hard because I grew up with such a racist view of the content I came from. So a lot of research is to undo the research. A lot of the research is to correct the perceptions. A lot of research, I have to look at first-hand sources. Like, I can't wait for the history book based on somebody's research. I have to get to the research. A lot of which is in French, actually. So there's a lot of that. There is a lot of excavation work. There's a lot of going against sources that you can't trust there, and building on glossary in terms of the languages. Also with that, you have to be careful because there's so many African languages, and the tonal ones are even different from the non-tonal ones, and so on. What I found myself doing is, instead of quoting a lot of, I quote a lot of them, but what I was really interested in was more the grammar systems. And a lot of that was because I found parallels in how Jamaicans speak, like the whole idea of tense being always present tense, which in Jamaica you're raised to think is backward English. When you realize that so many African languages, the verb stays present because action is always constant. That single thing blew my mind for days. But that's, opening up for research. One of the things that research also led me to is it was a research that led me having the Black Leopard being so queer, because you drink the Kool-Aid. Oh, it's Africa, they're homophobic. Oh, it's Uganda, they're homophobic. It's such and such. And then you went into the research, and I'm like, hold on, really? I wasn't looking for affirmation, but I found it. And because it's when you go back and read all these things. I remember once I was interviewing Chimamanda Adichie, and and we're talking, and she's saying, everybody know of the two grandmas, the two aunts down the road. Everybody know about those two uncles. They've always been there. Didn't think anything different until a bunch of white preachers told us that they were. But but that's what it does, and that's the big convoluted point I'm making is I don't go into research to find stuff to write in a book. I go into research to one, so I can have more than one life, so I can learn and explore and fight and cry and just sort of live in it. And sometimes I go, damn, there's a book here. This novel is almost writing itself. Because if I showed you the ideas I had for Black Leopard before research and the ideas after, you'd wonder who came up with the one for before. So yeah, I immerse and I commit myself to it. Usually, the actual writing for me is actually pretty quick, but it still takes me 3 years because I spent 2 years doing research.
Wow. Okay, I will just absorb that and ask Roye to answer.
Well, I was taking notes here on how I need to, step up my research. So, but from my own perspective, anyway, it's multiple things, right? Like it's like you said, reading books, and also getting as much oral accounts as well as you can. Obviously, the internet has made things a little bit easier, but you also have to be careful about what you find and make sure that you can verify it as well. Because like Marlon said, there's history and then there's laughable history as well that people write about Africa. So for me, it's really just trying to make sure that whatever it is that I find, I'm able to verify that this is actually accurate, because there's a lot of disinformation out there, misinformation out there, and you never want to be caught in that trap, because like Marlon said, I actually grew up with a negative view of Africa and who I am and where I come from, and feeling like a second-class citizen in especially moving over here to the United States. And aside from doing research for some of the stuff that I write, there's empowerment in seeing where you're coming from and seeing what you come from and seeing what your ancestors did and how powerful they were, how smart they were, and how much they contributed to the world, not just even Africa alone. I think there's a lot of power in that for just yourself as opposed to even just writing. So for me, it's twofold. It's one, obviously trying to be accurate, and there's still creative license that you take, because after all, we're writing fantasy here, or at least, speculative fiction, whatever you want to call it. There's so many names right now for these things. I just get whatever. But anyway, that's a different topic. But yeah, to me, it's simple enough. But I think there's a different angle of empowerment that comes with research, especially for people like me that were born in the continent and didn't learn anything, weren't really taught anything about my history and what our people before me did, and some of the great accomplishments that they have. And my stories are not just to entertain and to show people cool stuff. It's also to be able to educate people that these characters are actually inspired by very real things. They may be fantastical, but the roots of these characters come from something that's very real.
Thank you, Roye. So how about you, Nnedi? What's your take?
Yeah, really, everything that's been said has been great. It's just great. And I feel like I just need to add to it as opposed to most. But, for me, it's like researching for what I'm writing. It's like, how do I describe it? It's a combination of a lot of things, because typically when I'm writing about something, it doesn't come from the research. The research is secondary, it's sort of icing on the cake. A lot of the things, like I've grown up with a very interesting view on the continent, an interesting view on Nigeria. My parents were taking me, my sisters and I, back to my parents' villages in Imo State when we were really small. And like I've always been one who likes to listen and who's been interested. So whenever we would go, I would just listen for things. And because I would listen to, especially when the elders were speaking, I would hear certain key words. So when I started writing, like these were key words that I wanted to know more about. I was always interested in them. I didn't have a negative view at all. I was very much enamored by where my parents came from. I grew up in the United States. I was enamored by it. Even with the negatives, it's just the energy of it all just kind of, I fell in love with that from the beginning. So that's always been the way that I've approached these stories that I'm writing. When I'm researching something, it's usually because I stumbled across something interesting and became obsessed with it. Not necessarily for that I'm going to write about it. It's just I was obsessed with it. And so being obsessed with it, you just kind of look around and learn stuff, and then it branches off. And so I stumble into something else. And so that would be a lot of how, and so when I finally sat down to write something, those things would come up. And so then I would do like this backward research, like go back and figure out more. So my research is nonlinear. It's very nonlinear. It's not something that where I'm like, okay, I want to write about this. Let me go research it. It rarely happens like that. Also, academia is interesting, like because, I was a professor for 10 years, also have 2 masters and a PhD, and so I've been steeped in academia. So part of, while studying for those degrees, I also fell in love with the libraries and discovered the academic libraries where I could just dig up this stuff that those who are not students didn't have access to. And I got obsessed with that too. So I just find things, and I just kind of, and those things would make it into my stories as well. So I learned how to do that research. And what Marlon was saying about old research, like old stuff being, I wouldn't say it's completely useless. It is good for laughs. It definitely is good for laughs. Like sometimes them getting like, you know, we have like these European anthropologists who would go into these communities, African communities, and just start mining stuff. And because they did that, certain things that are now lost were recorded, but are like inaccurately. So I'm fascinated by that too, the inaccuracy of it. Sometimes in the inaccuracy, there's something that's created that's really interesting. I don't know if that even makes sense, but like it's happened many times for me where I'm reading this really racist research where I'm like, this anthropologist is like off his rocker, and there's something, and through that perspective, he would view the people in a certain way that I found like, I'm like, oh, that's interesting. I could do something with that. So like that old research has a value, but in a way that isn't that I didn't expect. And there's one British, like this really old British anthropology book that was like on some part of the Calabar region, and it's hilarious. This man's view of like the wildlife and his dealing with the wildlife and the difficulties of it, and getting bitten by everything. And he was extremely racist, but the thing was hilarious, and his view of the wildlife was very useful to me. So like it's that kind of research I love doing. Of course, there's the research where, you know, you're writing about something and you need to know all of everything about this thing from every angle, and that can be tricky as well. Like understand, so it's not just reading what's there, but it's also knowing who's written it and knowing that perspective, and then reading, knowing that, and picking through, which I find can be very, very difficult. But it's I find that part enjoyable too. And then the last thing I'll say to writers is don't get lost in your research. Because research can also be a form of procrastination as well. You can get completely lost in it and just kind of spend all your time doing that as opposed to the story. So you gotta reel it in, you know, give some time if you want to obsess about it, but if you want to get that story written, you gotta put some constraint on it.
I feel like you're speaking to my life.
And mine
I love to narrate. And research is a great way to narrate.
Thank you very much, Nnedi. The second question is the last one we can take from attendees. This one is from Mariam Abdullahi. She's from Kaduna here in Nigeria. She asks, she says, the awards, the other media crossover, the buzz, all three of you have these in spades. Do you ever feel any pressure to tell a grander story than the previous one? That's from Mariam Abdullahi, Kaduna. She's 19. Okay, yeah. I would ask Nnedi to go first.
Okay, that's what I'm writing down the question. I'm working on a lot of different things right now. I'm working on 5+ film TV projects. I'm working on 2 novels, and I'm working on 2 graphic novels. And yeah, I've my graphic novel LaGuardia just won the Eisner Award and a Hugo Award, all that. There's always buzz and all of that. But when I sit down to write, I don't care about the buzz at all. That has nothing, completely separate. I will, I don't worry about that, because if I worry about that, then that starts infecting, and in my opinion, it would start killing what it starts killing the muse, it kills the reason why I do what I do. So those things, like all of that, all of the noise is completely separate from the things what I'm working on. In terms of trying to write something grander, I don't think of it like that. It's not a hierarchy. I'm not trying to one up myself. Like, oh, let me write something next that can win this award. Let me try. I don't try to win awards. I don't do that at all. I write what I want to write. And sometimes, like, there have been things when I wrote Binti, I had no, and that's, this, whatever you want, the African girl goes into space opera, whatever. But like, when I wrote that, I wrote that like there was nothing. I wasn't thinking, oh, there's a dearth of this. No, this is never, you know, things like this are not done. I wasn't thinking that. I was thinking, I want to write this character. I want to write this story. This is really exciting. I wasn't thinking about, like, I had no idea that people would connect with that the way they can. I had no idea. It didn't cross my mind. So it's like, yeah, it's not a hierarchy. You know, I'm not trying to do this. Every story, everything that I write, every story is different. Every story has its purpose to me, and every story is special to me. That's why when people ask me, which of your books do you like most? They're like my children. I don't have favorites. All came from something. They're all dear to me. They're all, yeah. So, yeah.
Thank you, Nnedi. Roye, you're up next.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask Nnedi, when do you find the time to sleep with all those projects? But I guess we can talk about that offline. But yeah, I mean, I just write. I just create what I want to see. You know, I mean, we're all human. Like, you know, is it nice to win awards? Of course it is. But like Nnedi said, I think you fall into a very deep trap if you write to win awards. That is just to me, it's like it's a nail in the coffin for you if that's what motivates you. Yeah, and I try to stay even keel as best as possible. Never get too high on praise, never get too low on criticism. Yeah, to me, it's I try to get better with each book. I will say that I try to be, you know, a better writer with each project that I do. You know, trying to outdo myself or do something grand, I try not to. I try not to think that way. I just try to be true to myself and continue to not fall under the pressure, because there's pressure to do things a certain way or to conform to a certain trend because you want to get your book, you know, made into a show or whatever. So okay, how about I switch it up a little bit? So that, to me, that's what I try to battle. Like just continue to do what you do best, and I write the stories that you want to see, and then just leave it out there. As long as you've done your best, I always tell people, as long as you've done your best, there's nothing else. What more could you have done? Like, just do your best and put it out there, and then let what would be. And yeah, that's just the way I look at it. And the writer saying that, oh, like, you know, having, you know, awards in spades, I would say that for Marlon and Nnedi, I'm still trying to get to that point where my awards are in spades. Yeah, I just wanted to put that out there. But yeah, just do what you love, and just let the chips fall where they may.
Thank you, Roye. Yeah, Marlon, what do you think?
I mean, I do think I mean, I don't know if I necessarily, when I write, I try to write better than before, as so much as I just don't want to feel like I'm doing the same thing over. And it's more like, do I feel like I'm going in a different, not necessarily a different direction, but feel like a different territory. And the territory could be style, or it could be so on. And I also, you know, I tend to write things that initially I have no idea how to do them. And they always start from that sort of, I'm going to fall flat on my face with this book. And I think that with everything I write, this is where I'm going to fall flat on my face. This is where it's going to crash, and so on. In terms of the whole commercial stuff and accolades and so on, you know, my first book, the first print run was like 2,000 copies. You know, I started from the point where nobody would review me, nobody cared about stuff, and I think when you start from that, there are two ways you can go. You can be very skeptical of things like awards and so on, or at least put them in perspective, or you can let it go to your head and you become a jackass. Yeah, it's and I think it's for me, hopefully it's the former. Yeah, I'm used to, you know, begging for a spot at these book festivals and so on. And I think in that sense, you do realize that a lot of that stuff, it's cool, but it's not necessarily real. And you can't bring that with you into the room. You can't bring that with you to the laptop or the typewriter. Yeah. Because you're right, as you know, you do end up start writing. Writing to meet a sort of commercial or whatever expectations, and you're no longer, to me, you're no longer writing. You're just trying to sort of meet these these things. And that's a terrible thing to bring into wherever you write and how you write. And I think every book you should still approach like it was the first novel you were writing before any of these things happen. And for me, that's crucial. So I still, I write for myself, and that hasn't changed, and it shouldn't change. And I write the books. I write the books that I feel I want to read. And I think it can be that simple. And I think those are pretty much all you need to write, because the awards will come, but the awards will also go. What if you don't win it next year? So, if you put too much stock in winning awards, you're gonna put just as much stock in not winning them.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good point.
And and that can be, then you end up like Kanye West, Christine and his Grammy in the toilet. Let's not from that. So I just feel, to me, the one thing, the way I feel about my work, and I do feel it's work, is that the work doesn't care. My new story though doesn't care how much people like the old story. It's the new story now. It certainly doesn't care if I'm having a bad day. It's like, nope, this is a story. And when for me, always realizing that it's a story, and it's a story that's important, and not even me to an extent. And I think that sort of keeps me in check.
Okay, thank you very much, Marlon. On this note, we will close our panel. It's been really, really wonderful talking to all you guys. Thank you very much, Nnedi, Roye, Marlon. I had a wonderful time talking to you guys, and I hope to talk to all of you again sometime soon. Mm-hmm. And yeah, good luck with all your various projects. Again, as a fan, I can't wait to read them all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We don't just think of ourselves as a bank. We think of ourselves as corporate citizens with responsibility for growing the economy. Reading and education is a key part of it. But equally important is having access to reading materials at home. A lot of the intervention we've done throughout this COVID is to ensure that people can safely navigate the uncertainties of the COVID crisis and come out of it ready for, to live again.
Let's take a ride to the past in the back of a phoenix. Let's float around the moon.
The dreams that we have are limited by what we have directly interacted with. What reading does is it makes it possible for you to begin to live in worlds that don't yet exist. One read creates a discipline of reading. One read puts me on a timeline. It gives me an important book and I have an opportunity to read it and to collaborate. It's almost like having someone who does your book selection for you. If you have editors and people who are really good at this saying to you, this is the book for the month, I value that. I want to be able to read in a community. I want reading to be a collaborative thing. I want reading to be a communing, and One Read allows me to do that. I will use One Read any day, anytime.
Stranger's Guide is not a typical American travel magazine. Our mission is to dive deep into a single location, commissioning work from great writers and photographers, famous individuals, as well as up-and-coming new voices. This year, we decided to go to Lagos. And we are proud of the volume we produced, with original work from some of Nigeria's best writers and photographers, working with luminaries like Wale Soyinka, Molara Wood, and Femi Kuti. We think this is a very special volume, and we're so excited to bring it back to Lagos.